I'm going to try to give you some information here on what's known as the economic cycle. I'm not sure how it's going to work on this program, but we'll try our best. So basically, every single sector of the economy goes in a circle. And there are good times, which are obviously up here, and there are bad times, which are obviously down here. The best way to think of it is like a rubber band. So the economy, each sector in the economy, and the entire economy of a country is like a rubber band that gets pulled and then retracts, and gets pulled and then retracts. But if the economy is allowed to grow so much so that you really pull on the on the elastic band very hard, it's going to snap. And that is basically what happened in 1929, causing the Great Depression. So I'll just erase all of this. So I'm going to draw a circle the best I can on this program, and we'll go from there. Basically, at the top, when things are going very, very well in a country, you have a period of overproduction. So that's the top end of the scale, overproduction. And at this point, companies, or like within a sector, you're going to have a situation where you'll have prices fall. We also call this like a sale. In addition to that, companies will lay off workers. So your unemployment goes up. When your workers start to lose their jobs, in other words, the unemployment rate goes up, and you have a decrease in spending. And when there's a decrease in spending, that means more workers will get laid off. Eventually, you have, we'll use example of factories, but any business, factories close. So at that point, I don't know why I put IES there. I guess I'll make it grammatically correct. No, that's right. Factories close. And when all the factories close, your supply falls, and then you have a period of limited growth. So your economy doesn't grow. At some point, though, people are going to want things again. So whatever the case may be, think of anything that you buy. If there's a surplus of it in the markets, and then there's no demand, and the prices fall and follow what you see on the screen in front of you, at some point, though, there's going to be none of them left. And so people are going to say, well, I like this thing, and so they're going to continue to want it. And so what you're going to have then is an increase in demand. That's demand there, increases. And so when demand increases, well, factories will start making it again. And factories need workers. So your unemployment rate drops. And then when people are working, they have money. So they start to increase their spending. And of course, this goes across all the sectors, because more people working means more people spending. So every time you spend money, you're creating jobs. And then, with this demand, prices go up. And of course, change my color here. When prices go up, this is known as inflation. Go back to black. But as prices go up and you start to have a good economy, eventually demand drops. Sorry, I got kind of messy there. And then you get back to your period of overproduction. A healthy economy has periods of boom, leading to a period of recession, leading to a period of recovery. As long as the highs aren't too high and the lows aren't too low, every economy and certain sectors within economies will go through this process about every 5 or 10 years, depending on the different sector or the country. There's lots of different factors. I'm making this as simplistic as possible, but that's basically what happens to an economy. Things are going well, and when things are going well, the only way for them to go, of course, is down, and as long as they don't go too far down, then they'll come back again, and the economy will correct itself. Now, of course, outside of that cycle, so I should state this, I'm not drawing this on the same slide because a depression is not part of the usual economic cycle. We don't always have depressions. So if we're talking about a depression, that's where it falls outside the cycle that we just drew. So think of it falling off the bottom of the circle. It's below the circle if you want. If you're taking notes and you want to draw it on a piece of paper, draw it below your period of limited growth. Because this is prolonged. Period of economic, what they call stagnation. And so the stagnation, you actually don't know you're in a depression until you're out of it, because a depression looks kind of like a recession at first, and then as it becomes worse and worse and goes longer and longer, you realize, in fact, you aren't in one. You are now in depression. Okay, I was interrupted, but now I'm back, and I realize I misspelled prolonged. So yes, a depression is a prolonged period of economic stagnation. We see very high. So this is not a couple of percent. This is, during the Great Depression, we're talking over 20%, which means 1 out of every 5 people that should be working are not working. High unemployment. And the biggest thing about a depression is the economy cannot recover on its own. You need spending. And if you remember the cycle, factories are closing, supply is falling, there's decreased spending, there's limited growth, no one has any money, they're probably starting to eat into their own savings and trying to survive through this latest period of poor economic times. Who is going to spend the money to make sure that we can get out of this? And if it's not going to be people, only one group can spend the money. And I'm going to make sure we see this. And that group would be the government. So when you're looking at some of the changes economically and socially for governments that came out of the Depression, one of the things you really want to focus on is what type of things governments do today to make sure that things do not go the way they did in 1930 through 1939. I mentioned to a couple of students that the stock market actually crashed harder in 1989 than it did in 1929. But because of the lessons learned during the 20s of government controlling the economy and also having the social infrastructure in place to allow people to recover and not go so deep in debt that they couldn't get out of it, we didn't have a Great Depression in the 1990s. So those are some of the things that you'll want to look at for the purposes of this assignment. Another thing that's fairly important to note is the governments, they can't really be blamed about not understanding what to do in this situation. Again, you don't know you're in a depression until it's lasted long enough and the employment rates are high enough that you're in the depression, and you have a hard time getting out of it. You can't predict that when the economy is going poorly, in the case of the recession, it's not just simply going to jump back. So one of the things they often did was throw up large tariff walls to protect their industry, and they did this because when countries were in their infancy in their industrialization, tariffs did help them by making their own factories work and people not buying products from other countries. But this was not the way to go. Again, it's just limiting growth, not allowing any trade. In addition to that, what makes the Great Depression so timely is the fact that there was still huge international debt from World War One. So that was another factor involved in it. And one of the things about this international debt was a lot of it was, of course, owed to the United States. And as their economy fell, so did everyone else's. So that's pretty much all I have on this right now. I think I've been interrupted about 25 times doing this lecture, so I hope when it all pieces together, it makes some sort of sense. And hopefully this gave you an idea, a little bit of the economic cycle, but also an idea of why things happen the way they did when the stock market crashed in 1929. It's important you understand that what's known as Black Tuesday was not the sole cause of the Depression. It was just an indication that something was wrong to the system. And because no one had any money, basically you had no one spending money, and you don't get that period of recovery, which you need increased spending to do. And if no one's going to spend money, again, the government has to, and the governments at the time didn't understand this and weren't willing to take it on because of the international debt that many of them already had because of World War One. One last thing to offer you in terms of why things got so poor was a couple of things, but the biggest was this concept of buying on margin. And basically, what that means is if you wanted to buy 100% of something, you'd only have to put 10% down. So in the case of a house, this is often what people do, but you actually have something concrete that you can live in. It often, is at least stable in price. Sometimes, most of the time, goes up in price. So it's not very often that buying a home comes back to hurt you financially. Stocks are completely different. So at the time, they allowed people to basically buy on margin. This allowed the average person to invest in the stock market for the first time in the 1920s. And so when things went sour, they not only lost the 10% they had put towards the stock, but they owed 90% to a bank. The banks started calling in their loans, so many people went bankrupt, losing their homes. In addition to that, their factories were closing, they've lost their jobs, so they have no ability to pay for any of these debts that they have. Finally, when enough people tell the bank that they can't pay them back, but the bank needs their money to survive, the banks end up going bankrupt. So people that had their money in banks, even though they did invest in the stock market, would lose all of their savings, everything that they had. Again, losing all of your savings isn't as bad as losing money on margin, because at least you're only losing what you have. But when you have no ability to get a job and no ability to continue to buy food and pay for electricity, you can see why so many people at the time were essentially, some of the stories you're probably reading about of riding the rails, going from town to town, husbands leaving their children and their wives just trying to find work and send money home. So that's another reason why it was such a desolate time, because of this. Again, you're not allowed to do this today. If you buy stock, you have to be able to pay for stock. You can't buy a portion of it and then hope that the stock market goes up and get money back. So another example of something governments have done to become more involved in the economy to ensure that this Great Depression never happens again.